Hello there, boys and girls. I'm Otto Otter with a message for safe water. We otters have always had fun around water, but there can be danger there, too. So maybe what we have to say will help you stay out of trouble. I put together a little poem to go with some pictures about Otto Otter's rules for safe water. Look and listen closely, because a friend of mine is going to have some questions after I finish. Are you ready? Well, let's go. You ought to learn how to swim and float. You ought to know how to be safe in a boat. You ought to plan to swim protected by a lifeguard. You ought to play safely even in your own yard. You ought to not swim with air-filled devices. You ought to stay away from where thin ice is. You ought to know special things about rivers and canals. You ought to always swim with one of your pals. You ought to swim with a life-saving station nearby. You ought to throw a line or extend a stick and not rescue by swimming try. You ought to obey signs and rules that are made. You ought to know how deep before you wade. You ought to stay out where there's concrete or steep, slippery sides. You ought to not take those dangerous tube rides. You ought to stay clear of the siphon or chute. You ought to realize dead people are not very cute. You ought to never dive into unfamiliar water. You ought to not wait for a close call to make you wiser. You ought to feel responsible to keep little tots away. You ought to be able to restore breathing you may need to know someday. You ought to not go swimming when it's night. You ought to be careful when the sun is bright. You ought to stay out of water that's cold. You ought to not tease those not quite so bold. You ought to swim in water that's pure and clean. You ought to watch out for moss. It can be mean. You ought to be careful when you're around water. You'll have more fun like Otto Otter.